In the winter of 1823, at a remote Pennsylvania seminary, 15 young men studying to become ministers died within 6 weeks of each other. Each death followed the same horrifying pattern: violent convulsions, speaking in tongues, and a peculiar blackening of the fingernails that physicians had never seen before. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, but the local doctor who examined the bodies refused to sign the death certificates. He claimed the symptoms matched no known disease. And more disturbing still, he discovered something in their blood that made him burn his medical notes and flee the county that very night. Immediately, the church authorities sealed the seminary, forbidding anyone from entering the grounds, and the 15 bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel. For 2 centuries, the Presbyterian Church has refused to discuss what happened at Whitmore Seminary, but recently discovered letters from a surviving student reveal a truth so disturbing that it explains why some secrets are meant to stay buried forever. Before we continue with the story of Whitmore Seminary and uncover what really killed those 15 young men, I need to tell you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to seek the truth behind America's darkest mysteries. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, stories that have been buried by institutions and forgotten by time. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You're someone who needs to know what others are afraid to discover. So, hit that subscribe button and join the select few who know these secrets, and tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you brave enough to hear mysteries from your own backyard? Now, let's return to that cursed winter in Pennsylvania, where something far more sinister than disease was claiming young lives. The story begins in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where the Presbyterian Church had established Whitmore Seminary in 1819. Named after the Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a prominent minister who had died fighting in the Revolutionary War, the seminary was built to train the next generation of Presbyterian ministers for the expanding American frontier. On 200 acres of pristine woodland, the institution sat, with a main building constructed of local limestone and a small chapel that could seat 50 people. Surrounding the main complex were dormitories, a dining hall, faculty housing, and a working farm that provided food for the community, all connected by cobblestone paths that wound through towering oak and maple trees. From across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, the seminary attracted young men, drawn by its reputation for rigorous theological education and its affordable tuition. Most students came from farming families or small towns, eager to serve God and bring civilization to the wild territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The curriculum was demanding. Students studied Greek and Latin, biblical exegesis, systematic theology, homiletics, church history, and practical ministry skills. They attended chapel twice daily, maintained strict schedules, and were expected to live lives of exemplary moral conduct. Rigorous was the selection process for students, requiring letters of recommendation from local ministers, evidence of academic preparation, and a detailed testimony of their calling to ministry. Its responsibility to train godly men for the frontier was taken seriously by the Presbyterian Church, where ministers often served multiple congregations across vast distances and faced challenges that required both theological knowledge and practical wisdom. In the autumn of 1823, 43 students were enrolled at Whitmore Seminary. The eldest was 28-year-old Marcus Hartwell, a former school teacher from Lancaster County who had felt called to ministry after his wife died in childbirth. A serious, contemplative man was Marcus, who had read extensively in theology and philosophy before coming to the seminary. For his maturity, his fellow students respected him and often sought his counsel on both academic and personal matters. The youngest was barely 18, Timothy Brennan, the son of Irish immigrants who had scraped together every penny to send their boy to seminary. When the boy was 14, Timothy's father had died in a mining accident, and for 4 years his mother had worked as a seamstress to save enough money for his education. The weight of his family's sacrifices was carried by Timothy, and he was determined to succeed, often studying late into the night by candlelight. Between them were farmers' sons like Samuel Brewster, whose family had worked the same land in Lancaster County for 3 generations. For his robust health and cheerful disposition, Samuel was known, always ready with a joke or encouraging word for his classmates. There was also Peter Cunningham, a quiet young man from western Pennsylvania who had been raised by his grandfather after his parents died of fever. Intensely pious was Peter, and he spent hours each day in private prayer, often fasting and seeking divine guidance for his future ministry. From a well-to-do Philadelphia family came James Morrison, a family that had initially opposed his decision to enter the ministry. His father, a successful merchant, had wanted James to join the family business, but the young man had felt an irresistible call to serve God. Articulate and well-educated was James, with a particular gift for languages that made him one of the seminary's best students in Greek and Hebrew. Thomas Millikin, whose family had settled in Pittsburgh in the early 1800s, was known for his intellectual curiosity and his tendency to ask probing questions that sometimes made his professors uncomfortable. Beyond the required curriculum, Thomas had read widely and was fascinated by the theological controversies that were beginning to emerge in American Presbyterianism. He was particularly interested in the relationship between reason and revelation and how the church should respond to new philosophical ideas coming from Europe. David Crane, who would later become the sole survivor of the group's terrible ordeal, was a practical young man from a farming family in central Pennsylvania. Not by dramatic religious experience, but by a steady conviction that God was calling him to serve, he had been drawn to ministry. For his reliability and common sense, David was well liked by his classmates, though he sometimes struggled with the more abstract theological concepts that came easily to students like Thomas and James. The head of the seminary was Dr. Cornelius Ashford, a stern but fair man in his 50s who had studied at Princeton Seminary under the renowned theologian Archibald Alexander. To establish Whitmore Seminary, Dr. Ashford had been personally recruited by the Presbyterian Church, and he had brought with him a reputation for scholarly excellence and pastoral wisdom. From his students, he demanded excellence, but for their spiritual and intellectual development, he was known to be genuinely concerned. On campus, Dr. Ashford lived with his wife Margaret and their teenage daughter, Sarah. A cultured woman was Margaret Ashford, who had been educated at a female seminary in Philadelphia, and she took an active interest in the welfare of the students, often inviting them to dinner and providing maternal guidance to young men far from home. Sarah, 18 years old and possessed of both beauty and intelligence, was beloved by the students for her kind nature and sharp wit. Often she helped in the seminary's library and had read more theology than many seminary graduates. The seminary's faculty included Professor Jonathan Hartley, who taught Greek and Hebrew and was known for his exacting standards and dry wit. Several years studying in Germany had been spent by Professor Hartley, and he brought continental theological perspectives to his teaching, though he was careful to maintain orthodox Presbyterian positions. There was also Professor William Sterling, who taught church history and homiletics. A gifted preacher was Professor Sterling, who had served several large congregations before accepting his teaching position, and his lectures were among the most popular at the seminary. Particularly harsh had been the autumn of 1823. In October, early snows had fallen, and by November, the seminary was already isolated by drifts that made travel to nearby towns difficult. Not entirely unwelcome was the isolation, as it created an atmosphere of intensive study and spiritual reflection that the faculty encouraged. Into their winter routine of concentrated academic work, the students had settled, their days filled with lectures, prayer, and preparation for the spring examinations that would determine their fitness for ordination. The atmosphere was one of quiet scholarship and devotion, with the only sounds being the scratch of quills on parchment, the rustle of pages, the soft murmur of evening prayers, and the occasional crack of logs in the fireplaces that heated the buildings. Over 3,000 volumes were contained in the seminary's library, including works by Calvin, Luther, Edwards, and other Reformed theologians, as well as commentaries, church histories, and works of practical theology. A strict schedule that had been carefully designed to promote both academic excellence and spiritual growth was followed by life at the seminary. At 5 a.m, students rose for private devotions, a practice that Dr. Ashford insisted was essential for maintaining spiritual vitality. Morning prayers were followed by breakfast at 6, a simple meal of porridge, bread, butter, and milk that was eaten in silence while one of the students read from a devotional work. At 7 o'clock, classes began and continued until noon with subjects ranging from biblical languages to church history to systematic theology. Notorious for their difficulty were Professor Hartley's Greek classes, and students often spent hours preparing for his recitations. More popular were Professor Sterling's church history lectures, as he had a gift for bringing ancient controversies to life and helping students understand how past theological debates affected contemporary church life. For study and preparation, afternoons were reserved, with a brief break for physical exercise when weather permitted. A gymnasium of sorts was maintained by the seminary in one of the outbuildings where students could engage in calisthenics and other approved forms of exercise. More popular were walks through the surrounding woods, which provided both physical activity and opportunities for reflection and prayer. At 6 o'clock, evening chapel was held and was attended by all students and faculty. Typically, Dr. Ashford preached, though visiting ministers and senior students were sometimes given the opportunity to deliver sermons. Traditional Presbyterian liturgy was followed by the services, with psalm singing, prayer, scripture reading, and preaching. A beautiful space was the chapel itself, with tall windows that let in the afternoon light and a simple but elegant pulpit carved from local walnut. For communal study time in the library or their dormitory common rooms, students gathered after evening chapel. This was a time for discussion of the day's lectures, collaborative work on assignments, and informal theological debate. Often intense were the conversations as young men grappled with complex theological questions and prepared themselves for ministries that would require them to provide spiritual guidance to others. By 9 o'clock, students were expected to be in their rooms, though many continued studying privately until much later. Spartanly furnished were the dormitories, but comfortable enough, with each student having a small room containing a bed, desk, chair, washstand, and a small bookshelf. By large fireplaces in the common areas, the buildings were heated, though individual rooms could become quite cold during the harsh Pennsylvania winters. Their own quarters were expected to be maintained by students, and they were to assist with general upkeep of the seminary grounds. Small but supportive of the seminary's mission was the surrounding community of Millbrook. About 300 souls consisted of the town, mostly farmers and craftsmen, who provided goods and services to the seminary. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a grist mill, and a small Presbyterian church where Dr. Ashford sometimes preached when the regular minister was away. Pride in having the seminary in their midst was taken by the townspeople, and they often attended special events and graduation ceremonies. On the morning of December 3, 1823, came the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Thomas Milliken, a 22-year-old student from Pittsburgh, failed to appear for morning chapel. Highly unusual was this, as Thomas was known for his punctuality and had never missed a chapel service in his 2 years at the seminary. When his roommate David Crane went to check on him, he found Thomas writhing on his bed, his body contorting in violent spasms while unintelligible words poured from his lips. But what struck David most was not the convulsions or the strange utterances. It was Thomas's fingernails, which had turned completely black as if they had been dipped in ink. Immediately, David called for help, his shouts echoing through the dormitory corridors and rousing other students from their morning preparations. Within minutes, several classmates had gathered in Thomas's room, their faces pale with shock and concern as they witnessed their friend's inexplicable suffering. Unlike anything they had ever seen were the convulsions. So severely did Thomas's back arch that his body formed an almost perfect bridge, and with such violence did his limbs jerk that it took 3 students to hold him down and prevent him from injuring himself. Within minutes, Dr. Ashford arrived, having heard the commotion from his residence nearby. A man who prided himself on maintaining composure in difficult situations was the seminary's head, but even he was visibly shaken by what he observed. Back until only the whites were visible had Thomas's eyes rolled, and the words pouring from his mouth sounded like Latin, but were twisted into something that seemed to mock the very prayers the students had been taught to recite. Dominus viscum infernum, Thomas repeated over and over, his voice growing more guttural with each repetition. Corpus diaboli anima peritita. The words were recognizable as Latin, but they formed phrases that no Orthodox Christian would ever utter. Fluent in Latin from his theological studies was Dr. Ashford, and he felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Thomas was speaking in blasphemous inversions of sacred liturgical phrases. Immediately, Dr. Ashford summoned the local physician, Dr. Edmund Whitley, who lived in the nearby town of Millbrook. On horseback through the snow-covered roads, a messenger was dispatched with instructions to bring the doctor back as quickly as possible. While they waited, Dr. Ashford led the gathered students in prayer for Thomas's recovery, though their voices trembled with uncertainty and fear. Within 2 hours, Dr. Whitley arrived, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with concentration. For over 30 years, he had been practicing medicine and had seen his share of strange ailments. But what he witnessed at Whitmore Seminary that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. Everything Dr. Whitley knew about medicine was defied by Thomas's symptoms. Rapid and irregular was the young man's pulse, sometimes racing so fast it seemed his heart might burst, then suddenly slowing to an almost imperceptible rhythm. Other disturbing symptoms were revealed by the doctor's examination. Laboured was Thomas's breathing and accompanied by a strange whistling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. A peculiar greyish pallor had taken on his skin that Dr. Whitley had never seen in any living patient, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. From Thomas's fingernails to his entire hands, the black discoloration had spread, and similar dark patches were appearing on his neck and around his eyes. Most disturbing were the words he spoke during his convulsions. Consistently blasphemous were the Latin phrases, inverting traditional prayers and liturgical responses in ways that suggested either profound theological knowledge or some form of supernatural influence. Though not a deeply religious man, Dr. Whitley found himself deeply unsettled by the precision and consistency of Thomas's blasphemous utterances. To calm the convulsions, Dr. Whitley administered laudanum and applied cold compresses to bring down the fever, but nothing seemed to help. He tried bleeding Thomas, following the medical practices of the time, but darker than normal was the blood that flowed from the incisions and seemed to coagulate almost immediately. To purge any potential toxins, he attempted to induce vomiting, but only a foul-smelling black bile was produced by Thomas's stomach that stained the basin and filled the room with an odor like rotting eggs. Throughout the day, word of Thomas's condition spread through the seminary community. In small groups, students gathered, whispering prayers and theories about what might have caused their classmates' strange illness. A form of consumption might be what it was, suggested some, though none had seen consumption present in such a bizarre manner. If Thomas had been bitten by some venomous creature that had somehow survived the early winter, others wondered. Perhaps a snake or spider that had taken refuge in the warm dormitory buildings. About divine judgment or demonic possession began to mutter a few of the more superstitious students, though Dr. Ashford quickly silenced such talk. He reminded them that they were training to be ministers of the gospel and that they should seek rational explanations for unusual events rather than resorting to superstition and fear. However, even Dr. Ashford found himself struggling to explain Thomas's symptoms in purely medical terms. As evening approached, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate. More violent became the convulsions, and the blasphemous Latin phrases gave way to sounds that seemed barely human. Despite her father's protests, Sarah Ashford insisted on helping to care for Thomas, bringing fresh water and clean linens. By how cold Thomas's skin felt to the touch, she was struck, despite the fever that was clearly ravaging his body. Throughout the night, the other students maintained a prayer vigil, taking turns reading scripture and offering intercessions for their friend's recovery. Of profound sadness and growing fear was the atmosphere in the dormitory as the young men grappled with the possibility that they might lose their classmate to this mysterious ailment. At 3 o'clock in the morning on December 4th, Thomas Milliken died, exactly 21 hours after the first convulsions began. A sudden return of consciousness and clarity that startled everyone present marked his final moments. The convulsions stopped, his eyes focused, and he looked directly at Dr. Whitley with an expression of profound terror and regret. His final words, spoken in a moment of clarity just before his death, were recorded by Dr. Whitley in his medical notes. The book in the chapel, God forgive us all. With such intensity and conviction were the words spoken that everyone present felt their significance, though none understood what Thomas meant by them. That Thomas's voice had returned to its normal tone for these final words was noted by Dr. Whitley, in stark contrast to the guttural sounds that had emerged during his illness. After speaking these words, Thomas's eyes closed, his breathing stopped, and his body relaxed into the stillness of death. From his skin, the black discoloration began to fade almost immediately, leaving behind only the pale complexion of a young man who had died far from home and family. Thoroughly, Dr. Whitley examined the body, noting that many of the strange symptoms had disappeared with death, as if whatever had afflicted Thomas had departed with his final breath. 2 days later, the funeral was held, with Thomas's body laid to rest in the small cemetery behind the chapel. About the young man's devotion to his studies and his desire to serve God on the frontier, Dr. Ashford delivered a moving eulogy. He spoke of Thomas's intellectual gifts and his passion for theological learning, traits that had made him a favorite among both faculty and students. By all the students and faculty was the service attended, as well as several townspeople who had come to know Thomas during his time at the seminary. Openly, many wept as they said goodbye to their friend and classmate. Particularly affected by the loss was Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, as Thomas had served as something of an older brother figure to him. At the graveside, Marcus Hartwell delivered a prayer, asking God to receive Thomas's soul and to grant comfort to those who mourned his passing. But even as they mourned Thomas's death, a sense of unease had settled over the seminary community. The strange nature of his illness, the rapidity of his decline, and his final cryptic words had shaken everyone's sense of security and normalcy. That whatever had killed Thomas was likely an isolated incident had been assured by Dr. Whitley, perhaps caused by spoiled food or exposure to some unknown toxin. But in the face of such unusual symptoms, his words rang hollow. With renewed intensity after Thomas's death, the winter seemed to press in around the seminary. More heavily fell the snow, louder howled the winds through the trees, and under the weight of the cold and the weight of grief, the building seemed to creak and groan. Of strange dreams and difficulty sleeping began to complain students. Footsteps in the corridors at night were reported by some, though investigation always revealed empty hallways. To something more anxious and fearful began to give way the atmosphere of quiet scholarship that had characterized the seminary. That his students seemed distracted during their Greek recitations was noticed by Professor Hartley, their minds clearly elsewhere despite their efforts to concentrate on their studies. That his church history lectures, usually received with enthusiasm, were met with worried faces and absent stares out the windows at the dark winter landscape was found by Professor Sterling. By adhering strictly to the seminary schedule and encouraging the students to find comfort in their studies and devotions, Dr. Ashford tried to maintain normalcy. He increased the frequency of chapel services and arranged for special prayer meetings focused on seeking God's comfort in times of trial. But despite his efforts, over the community like a dark cloud that refused to lift hung the shadow of Thomas's death. What none of them realized was that only the beginning was Thomas Milliken's death. Over the following weeks, the true horror would unfold, claiming life after life in a pattern so precise and methodical that it would challenge everything the survivors believed about disease, death, and the nature of evil itself. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, on December 9th, another student began showing the same terrifying symptoms. James Morrison, a quiet young man from Philadelphia who had been Thomas's study partner and closest friend at the seminary, woke his roommate with the same violent convulsions that had marked Thomas's final day. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning began the convulsions, the same time that Thomas had died, a coincidence that would not be lost on those who witnessed both events. In every detail, the pattern was identical. Within hours appeared the same black fingernails, from his lips poured the same twisted Latin phrases, and across his skin like a shadow spread the same grayish pallor. The symptoms were immediately recognized by James's roommate, William Foster, and he ran to fetch Dr. Ashford and Dr. Whitley, his bare feet slapping against the cold dormitory floors as panic gripped his heart. Again, Dr. Whitley was summoned, this time with a growing sense of dread that had settled in his stomach like a cold stone. Since Thomas's death, he had spent the days researching every medical text he could find, seeking some explanation for the bizarre symptoms he had witnessed. To colleagues in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, he had written describing the case and asking for their insights, but nothing in his extensive library or correspondence offered any clues that could explain what he had seen. The blackened fingernails, the convulsions, the strange vocalizations taken individually, each symptom might have had a rational explanation. Convulsions could be caused by poisoning, the circulation could be affected by certain diseases causing discoloration, and incoherent speech could lead to delirium. But together, they formed a pattern that seemed to exist outside the bounds of known medicine, a combination of symptoms that appeared in no medical textbook Dr. Whitley had ever studied. As Dr. Whitley examined James Morrison, he was struck by the precise similarity to Thomas's condition. Not only were the symptoms identical, but they appeared to be progressing at exactly the same rate. At the same speed spread the black discoloration from the fingernails, the same pattern of intensity was followed by the fever, and word for word were repeated even the specific Latin phrases. As if James was following some predetermined script that had already been written by Thomas's illness, it was. Now openly terrified were the students who gathered to witness James' suffering. Any remaining hope that Thomas's death had been an isolated incident had been shattered by the coincidence of two identical illnesses occurring so close together. Through the dormitory began to spread whispers about curses and divine judgment, though Dr. Ashford continued to insist on rational explanations and discourage superstitious speculation. Exactly 21 hours after his symptoms began, James Morrison died, just as Thomas had. Identical were his final words, the book in the chapel, God forgive us all. Through everyone present sent a chill the precision of the timing and the repetition of the same final message. Some form of contagion had begun to be suspected by Dr. Whitley, though he had never encountered any disease that produced such consistent symptoms and timing. That James's body be prepared for burial immediately was ordered by the possibility of contagion leading Dr. Whitley, and that his personal effects be burned as a precautionary measure. Quarantine procedures were also instituted by him, requiring that anyone who had been in close contact with either Thomas or James be isolated and monitored for signs of illness. The dormitory where both men had lived was sealed and fumigated with sulfur smoke, a standard practice for dealing with potentially infectious diseases. Now openly terrified were the students, their fear palpable in every conversation and visible in every face. Their sense of safety and normalcy had been shattered by 2 deaths in a week, both following the same horrifying pattern. Now like a trap from which death might emerge at any moment to claim another victim felt the seminary, which had been a place of learning and spiritual growth. By increasing the frequency of chapel services and encouraging the students to find comfort in prayer and study, Dr. Ashford attempted to maintain order. He arranged for additional prayer meetings and Bible studies, hoping that increased devotional activity might provide both spiritual comfort and practical distraction from their fears. He also wrote to the Presbyterian church authorities in Philadelphia, informing them of the situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. Swift and decisive was the response from Philadelphia. Immediately was dispatched the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, a senior administrator in the Presbyterian Church, to investigate the situation and provide assistance. For his calm demeanor and practical approach to crisis management was Dr. Blackwood known, having dealt with various emergencies in Presbyterian institutions throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. But before Dr. Blackwood could arrive, the pattern repeated itself again. On December 12, 3 days after James Morrison's death, it happened a third time. This time, the victim was Samuel Brewster, a 25-year-old from rural Lancaster County who had been known for his robust health and cheerful disposition. One of the most popular students at the seminary had been Samuel, always ready with a joke or encouraging word for his classmates, and shock waves through the entire community sent his illness. In every terrifying detail, the pattern was identical. At 3 o'clock in the morning began violent convulsions, blackened fingernails, twisted Latin phrases, grayish pallor, and death exactly 21 hours later. The same as his predecessors were Samuel's final words, the book in the chapel, God forgive us all. So precise was now the repetition that Dr. Whitley began to document every aspect of the illness, hoping to find some clue that might explain the impossible consistency. 3 deaths that followed the same impossible pattern had now been witnessed by Dr. Whitley. As a man of science and rational thought, he struggled to accept what he was seeing. Medical explanation was defied by the symptoms, unnaturally precise was the timing, and some shared knowledge or experience that connected the victims in ways he couldn't understand was suggested by the final words. That the deaths might not be natural at all had he begun to suspect, but he had no framework for understanding what else they might be. Some measure of relief to the beleaguered seminary community was brought by the arrival of Dr. Blackwood on December 15. A man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing was Dr. Blackwood. For over 40 years, he had served the Presbyterian Church and had dealt with everything from financial scandals to theological controversies. With the authority and confidence that came from decades of experience, he immediately took charge of the situation. Immediately, Dr. Blackwood convened a meeting with Dr. Ashford, Dr. Whitley, and the senior faculty to discuss the situation and develop a plan of action. Carefully, he listened to Dr. Whitley's detailed account of the 3 deaths, asking pointed questions about symptoms, timing, and any potential connections between the victims. He also interviewed several students who had been close to the deceased, seeking any information that might explain the mysterious pattern. Pragmatic and decisive was his assessment, though privately he was deeply troubled by what he had learned. That the seminary was dealing with some form of highly contagious disease that had not yet been identified by medical science was concluded by Dr. Blackwood. While he had never encountered anything like the symptoms Dr. Whitley described, he had seen enough epidemics to know that unknown diseases could sometimes emerge and devastate communities before doctors understood how to treat them. On this assessment, Dr. Blackwood ordered that the institution be quarantined immediately with no one allowed to enter or leave the grounds until the epidemic had run its course. To the Presbyterian Church authorities in Philadelphia, he sent word explaining the situation and requesting that prayers be offered for the seminary community. He also dispatched letters to the families of all students explaining the quarantine and assuring them that every precaution was being taken to protect their sons. From a place of learning into a prison of fear was transformed Whitmore Seminary by the quarantine order. With whatever was killing their classmates found themselves trapped the students, now numbering 37 after the 3 deaths. To the constant vigil against death became secondary the normal rhythms of academic life. The terrifying question of who would be next was brought by every morning. In the faculty building, Dr. Blackwood had taken up residence and assumed overall authority for managing the crisis. A man of firm faith and practical experience was he. But even he seemed shaken by the precise pattern of the deaths and the mysterious final words that each victim had spoken. A strict schedule of prayer services was established by him, hoping that divine intervention might halt whatever was claiming the students' lives. To maintain both order and morale was carefully structured the daily routine under quarantine. To include special prayers for protection and healing was extended morning chapel. Continued did classes, though professors struggled to maintain academic focus when everyone's thoughts were consumed by fear and grief. A buddy system with students paired to watch over each other and report any sign of illness immediately was instituted by Dr. Blackwood. On December 18 came the 4th death, claiming Peter Cunningham, a quiet student from western Pennsylvania, who had kept largely to himself since arriving at the seminary. For his intense piety and long hours of private prayer had Peter been known, often fasting and seeking divine guidance for his future ministry. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning began his illness, following the same terrifying pattern that had become grimly familiar to the seminary community. The convulsions, the blackened fingernails, the twisted Latin phrases, and the greyish pallor all appeared on schedule, as if Peter's body was following some invisible script written by the deaths that had come before. Every detail was documented by Dr. Whitley, noting that even the specific Latin phrases were identical to those spoken by the previous victims. Beyond anything that could be explained by natural disease or coincidence was the precision. Exactly 21 hours after his symptoms began, Peter Cunningham died, and identical to the others were his final words, the book in the chapel, God forgive us all. Intensely on these final words had begun to focus Dr. Whitley, convinced that they held the key to understanding the mysterious deaths. Specific and consistent was the reference to a book in the chapel, suggesting that all 4 victims had shared some knowledge or experience related to this mysterious book. Not only Dr. Whitley, but also Dr. Blackwood, who had extensive experience with theological controversies and church discipline, had begun to be intrigued by the mention of a book in the chapel. That dying words often carried special significance was understood by both men, and the consistency of the message across 4 different victims suggested that it was not merely the product of delirium or fever-induced hallucinations. About conducting a thorough search of the chapel, Dr. Blackwood approached Dr. Ashford, but the seminary's head was reluctant to disturb the sacred space based on what he considered the ravings of dying men. The heart of the seminary's spiritual life was the chapel, argued Dr. Ashford, and that searching it would undermine the students' faith and confidence in the institution. Rather than pursuing what he saw as superstitious speculation, he preferred to focus on medical solutions. However, That dying words often revealed secrets that the living were reluctant to acknowledge had been taught to Dr. Blackwood by his experience with church controversies. Cases of clerical misconduct, financial impropriety, and theological deviation had he investigated, and he knew that religious institutions sometimes harbored dark secrets beneath their pious exteriors. That a thorough investigation was necessary was convinced him by the consistency of the dying words, combined with the inexplicable nature of the deaths. By December 20th, the seminary was in the grip of full panic. Convinced that the food might be contaminated with whatever was causing the deaths, the students had begun to refuse meals. In small groups, they huddled together, reading scripture and praying constantly, their voices rising and falling in desperate pleas for divine protection. Signs of nervous exhaustion had begun to be shown by some, jumping at every sound and crying out in their sleep. To maintain order and continue the educational mission of the seminary struggled the faculty. But overwhelming was becoming the atmosphere of terror. By hollow-eyed students who could barely concentrate on their recitations were attended Professor Hartley's Greek classes. By sudden prayers and outbursts of fear when students thought they heard sounds in the hallways were interrupted Professor Sterling's church history lectures. To their families, several students had begun writing letters, begging to be allowed to leave the seminary despite the quarantine order. To his mother, Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, had written, expressing his fear that he would never see her again. To provide leadership and comfort to his younger classmates, had taken it upon himself Marcus Hartwell, the eldest and most mature student. But with the constant pressure of living under the shadow of death, even he was struggling. On the night of December 20th occurred the first break in the pattern, though its significance would not become clear until much later. David Crane, who had been Thomas Milliken's roommate and had witnessed the first death, approached Dr. Whitley with information that would change everything they thought they knew about the mysterious deaths. Visibly shaken was David and seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict as he sought out the doctor in his temporary quarters in the faculty building. As he knocked on Dr. Whitley's door, his hands trembled, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he asked if they could speak privately. Exhausted from days of futile medical efforts and growing dread, Dr. Whitley invited David into his room and offered him a chair. A confession that he had been carrying for weeks was what David revealed, a secret that he had been too frightened and ashamed to share, even as his friends died one by one. He told Dr. Whitley that he and several other students had been part of a secret study group that met in the chapel after evening prayers. A book that Thomas had discovered in a hidden compartment behind the altar had they been reading, a book that none of them had seen before, and that seemed to contain knowledge beyond anything they had learned in their regular studies. Like a physical blow hit Dr. Whitley the revelation. Here finally was a connection between the victims beyond the timing and symptoms of their deaths. If they had all been part of this secret study group, their deaths might not be random at all. To whatever they had been reading in that mysterious book that each victim had referenced in their final words, might they be connected? As he described the book and the group's activities, David's hands shook. According to his account, the book was bound in what appeared to be human skin, though none of them had wanted to examine it too closely. Of some form of parchment that seemed much older than anything else in the seminary's library were the pages made, and the text was written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that none of them could fully identify. By Thomas Milliken during routine maintenance work in the chapel in early October had the discovery been made. Old were the seminary's buildings and required constant upkeep, and students were often assigned to help with minor repairs and cleaning. Alone in the chapel one evening had Thomas been working when he noticed that one of the stones behind the altar seemed loose. When he investigated, he found a hidden compartment that contained the mysterious book, along with several other items that appeared to be very old. Immediately fascinated by the discovery had been Thomas, and he had shared it with his closest friends, James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and Marcus Hartwell. A secret study group to examine the book and attempt to decipher its contents had been formed by the 6 young men. After evening prayers, when the chapel was empty and the faculty had retired for the night, they began meeting twice weekly. According to David's trembling testimony, the book appeared to be some form of advanced theological text, but written in a style and language that seemed to predate anything they had studied in their regular curriculum. Knowledge of spiritual practices that went far beyond orthodox Presbyterian doctrine were suggested by the symbols and diagrams scattered throughout the text. With Hebrew words and strange symbols that resembled no alphabet any of them had encountered was interspersed the Latin text. That the book contained secret wisdom that could enhance their understanding of divine mysteries and make them more effective ministers had been convinced Thomas. That God had led him to discover the book for a purpose had he argued, and that they had a responsibility to study its contents and unlock its secrets. Initially skeptical had been the other members of the group, but Thomas's enthusiasm and apparent scholarly insights had gradually won them over. As David continued his confession, Dr. Whitley began to understand the full scope of what had been happening at the seminary. For nearly 3 months before the first death had the secret study group been meeting, studying the mysterious book and apparently experiencing effects that they had interpreted as spiritual enlightenment. How the group members had begun to feel superior to their fellow students was described by David, believing they had been chosen to receive special knowledge that would make them extraordinary ministers. Entirely unnoticed had not gone the group's activities. Lights in the chapel at unusual hours had been reported by several students, and strange sounds coming from the building during the night had been heard by some. These reports had been investigated by Dr. Ashford, but found nothing amiss during his inspections. Careful to cover their tracks had been the group, meeting only when they were certain the faculty was asleep and always returning the book to its hiding place before dawn. Not only text but also detailed instructions for various spiritual exercises and practices were contained in the book, revealed David. Some of these involved meditation techniques that were unlike anything taught in Orthodox Presbyterian theology. Others included dietary restrictions, specific prayers to be recited at particular times, and even instructions for creating what the book described as spiritual preparation chambers using candles, incense, and geometric patterns drawn on the floor. Initially, with what seemed like positive results, the group had begun implementing these practices. Vivid dreams in which they seemed to communicate with angelic beings who revealed profound truths about the nature of God and creation were experienced by them, they reported. More spiritually alive than ever before did they feel, and their academic performance actually improved as they applied insights from their secret studies to their regular coursework. But as David continued his account, it became clear that the supposed benefits had come with a price. Physical symptoms that they initially dismissed as signs of spiritual transformation had begun to be experienced by the members of the group. They suffered from headaches, insomnia, and strange sensations in their hands and feet. Their appetites changed, and they found themselves craving foods that they had never eaten before, particularly meat that was barely cooked. The most severe symptoms were experienced by Thomas, as the group's leader and the one who had discovered the book. Of a constant burning sensation in his stomach, he began to complain and reported that he could sometimes hear voices speaking to him in languages he didn't recognize. But instead of being alarmed by these symptoms, he had convinced himself and the others that they were signs of spiritual advancement, evidence that their souls were being prepared for higher forms of divine communication. Changes in their relationships with other students and faculty had also begun to be noticed by the group. Impatient with what they saw as the simplistic theology taught in their regular classes found themselves becoming they. On their classmates who seemed content with ordinary spiritual experiences and conventional understanding of Scripture did they look down. As an elite group chosen by God for special revelation and destined for extraordinary ministries began they to see themselves. Doubts about their activities had begun to be had by Marcus Hartwell, the eldest member of the group. In November, he told David that he had started experiencing nightmares in which the angelic beings they thought they were communicating with revealed themselves to be something far more sinister. Into hideous masks transformed the beautiful faces in these dreams, and into blasphemous mockeries of sacred truth turned the divine wisdom they offered. To end the group's meetings and return the book to its hiding place had wanted Marcus, but that his doubts were a test of his faith and commitment to the advanced knowledge they were receiving had been convinced him by Thomas. That spiritual progress always involved periods of testing, argued Thomas, and that Marcus was being challenged to demonstrate his worthiness to receive higher revelations. Intense had been the pressure within the group to continue their studies. Increasingly obsessed with the book had become Thomas and spent hours copying passages and creating his own interpretations of the symbols and diagrams. of their group as the chosen ones, had he begun to speak and claimed that they were being prepared for a special mission that would transform the Presbyterian Church and American Christianity. As David's confession continued, Dr. Whitley began to piece together a timeline that connected the group's activities to the pattern of deaths. In late November had appeared the first symptoms, beginning with Thomas, but gradually affecting all members of the group. Psychological changes that included increased aggression, paranoia, and a growing sense of superiority over others had been accompanied by the physical symptoms. Warnings about the consequences of improper study or abandoning the practices once they had been begun had also been contained in the book. According to David, there were passages that suggested terrible punishments for those who proved unworthy of the knowledge they had received. That those who began the spiritual journey outlined in the book but failed to complete it would face divine judgment in the form of physical and spiritual destruction was implied by the text. When Dr. Whitley pressed David about the current location of the book, the young man's face went pale and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. That the book had disappeared from its hiding place 3 days before Thomas's death was revealed by him. For their regular meeting on November 30th had the group gathered, only to find the hidden compartment empty. The entire chapel had they searched, but found no trace of the book or any sign that someone else had discovered their secret. Into a panic had thrown the group the disappearance of the book. That someone had discovered their activities and stolen the book to prevent them from completing their studies had been convinced Thomas. Increasingly agitated and paranoid had he become, accusing fellow students and even faculty members of spying on them and working to undermine their spiritual progress. In the days following the book's disappearance, more severe symptoms had begun to be experienced by the group members. The headaches became constant, the insomnia worsened, and shared nightmares in which they were pursued by dark figures who demanded that they return something they had stolen began they to have. That they were being tested were these experiences interpreted by Thomas, and that they needed to prove their commitment to the spiritual path they had begun. In an entirely new light was cast the deaths by David's revelation. If the victims had all been part of this secret study group, their deaths might not be the result of disease or natural causes at all. To whatever spiritual or psychological processes had been triggered by their study of the mysterious book might they be connected. With possibilities that lay outside his medical training and scientific worldview found himself grappling Dr. Whitley. Staggering were the implications of David's confession. If the book contained some form of dangerous knowledge or practices that had somehow caused the deaths, then with something far more complex than a medical epidemic might the seminary be dealing. That he needed to share this information with Dr. Blackwood immediately was realized by Dr. Whitley, as the church officials' experience with theological controversies might provide insights that medical science could not offer. Through the seminary community sent shock waves the discovery of the secret study group when Dr. Whitley shared David's confession with Dr. Blackwood. Immediate and decisive was the church officials' reaction. A full investigation was ordered by him, interrogating every student and faculty member about their knowledge of the group and the mysterious book. A conspiracy of silence that had been maintained for months was uncovered by him, with nearly half the student body aware of the secret meetings but too frightened to speak out. The depth of the deception that had been occurring under the seminary's roof was revealed by Dr. Blackwood's investigation. Accounts of seeing lights in the chapel at unusual hours, hearing strange chanting and unfamiliar prayers, and noticing changes in the behavior of the group members came forward with students. That they had been approached by Thomas Milliken about joining the group was admitted by several, but had declined, either from suspicion about the secretive nature of the activities or from concern about violating seminary rules. That he had noticed changes in the academic performance and behavior of several students, including Thomas, James, Samuel, and Peter was revealed by Professor Hartley. While their scholarly work had initially improved, they had become increasingly argumentative during class discussions and had begun to challenge orthodox theological positions in ways that seemed designed to provoke controversy rather than engage in legitimate scholarly debate. Similar observations about the group members' behavior during his church history lectures were reported by Professor Sterling. Dismissive of traditional Presbyterian teaching had they become and had begun to express ideas that seemed to draw from sources outside the approved curriculum. When questioned about their sources, they had been evasive and claimed to be developing their own theological insights through prayer and meditation. More disturbing than anyone had imagined was the truth that emerged from Dr. Blackwood's investigation. For nearly 3 months had the secret study group been operating, meeting twice weekly in the chapel after evening prayers. Of 6 students had the group consisted: Thomas Milliken, James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and Marcus Hartwell. The contents of the mysterious book had they been studying and implementing practices that were clearly outside the bounds of Orthodox Presbyterian theology. According to testimony from multiple witnesses, the group members had begun to exhibit signs of spiritual pride and exclusivity that were completely contrary to the humility and unity that the seminary sought to foster. An inner circle that looked down on their fellow students and seemed to believe they had access to superior spiritual knowledge had they formed. Within the student body had this attitude created tension and division, though few had understood the source of the problem. To recognize the warning signs of heretical movements and spiritual deception had been taught Dr. Blackwood by his experience with theological controversies. A classic pattern of spiritual corruption that he had encountered in other contexts was pointed to by the behavior described by witnesses, the secrecy, the claims of special revelation, the growing sense of superiority, and the departure from orthodox teaching. The significance of the fact that the deaths had begun only after the book had disappeared from its hiding place was also noted by the church official. That the book itself might not be the direct cause of the deaths was suggested by this, but rather that the deaths might be connected to the spiritual and psychological processes that had been set in motion by the group's activities. A thorough search of the chapel was ordered by Dr. Blackwood despite Dr. Ashford's continued reluctance to disturb the sacred space. The hidden compartment that David had described was revealed by the search along with evidence that it had recently been occupied. Traces of wax from candles, ashes from burned materials, and faint markings on the walls that suggested the presence of symbols or diagrams that had been partially erased were contained in the compartment. Other disturbing evidence of the group's activities was also revealed by the search. Behind the altar, investigators found geometric patterns carved into the floor that had been covered with rugs during regular services. Unlike anything found in Orthodox Christian art or architecture were these patterns, and seemed to serve some ritual purpose that remained unclear. A collection of papers hidden in a different location within the chapel was most significantly uncovered by the search. Handwritten notes and copies of passages from the mysterious book apparently made by Thomas Milliken during the group studies were contained in these papers. The extent of the group's departure from Orthodox Christianity was revealed by the notes and provided insight into the nature of the knowledge they had been pursuing. Spiritual practices that involved direct communication with supernatural entities, techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness, and methods for gaining power over other people through spiritual manipulation were described in the notes. A mixture of Christian terminology and concepts that seemed to draw from occult traditions that were completely foreign to Presbyterian theology was the language used. One particularly disturbing passage copied in Thomas's handwriting described a ritual for opening the gates between worlds that required the participation of 6 individuals who would serve as vessels for divine manifestation. Enhanced spiritual powers and direct access to divine knowledge were promised to the participants by the ritual, but it also warned of severe consequences for those who proved unworthy or who attempted to abandon the process once it had begun. That the group had unknowingly been performing some version of this ritual through their regular meetings and study sessions was realized by Dr. Whitley. A process that was now claiming their lives one by one had apparently been initiated by their focus on the book's contents, combined with their implementation of the spiritual practices it described. On December 21 occurred the 5th death, claiming Marcus Hartwell himself. Particularly significant was the timing, as Marcus had been the one member of the group who had expressed doubts about their activities and had wanted to end their meetings. As the previous 4 did his death follow the same pattern, but different and more revealing were his final words. Instead of referencing the book in the chapel, Marcus spoke repeatedly of being chosen and marked for the harvest. That he understood something about the nature of what was happening to the group members was suggested by his words, though he died before he could provide any clear explanation. This deviation from the pattern was noted by Dr. Whitley, wondering if it might provide a clue to understanding the mysterious deaths. The only surviving member of the original study group was now David Crane, a fact that was not lost on anyone at the seminary. With a mixture of sympathy and suspicion watched him the students and faculty, wondering if he would be the next victim or if he might hold the key to stopping the deaths. With guilt and terror was consumed David himself, convinced that he would soon follow his friends into death. Enormous was the psychological pressure on David. By his knowledge of the secret group and his role in their activities was he isolated from his classmates. Yet, the only person who could provide information that might prevent further deaths was he also. Hours questioning him about every detail of the group's activities spent Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Whitley, hoping to find some clue that might break the deadly pattern. That the book had contained detailed prophecies about what would happen to those who studied its contents was revealed by David. According to these prophecies, as bridges between worlds were destined to serve the 6 members of the group, allowing supernatural entities to manifest in the physical realm. The sacrifice of their physical lives would require the process, but to a higher plane of existence where they would serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms would their souls be elevated. That the process once begun could not be stopped or reversed was also suggested by the prophecies. By their study of the book and their participation in the ritual practices it described, had the 6 members of the group been marked by spiritual forces that would claim their lives at predetermined intervals, were they bound together, using their life energy to fuel the manifestation of supernatural entities in the physical world. That the deaths might be connected to some form of mass hysteria or shared delusion that had been triggered by the group's activities had begun to be suspected by Dr. Whitley. The power of suggestion combined with guilt and fear about their secret activities might have created psychological conditions that manifested as physical symptoms. However, inadequate seemed this explanation because of the precision of the timing and the consistency of the symptoms. That the group had become involved with genuinely dangerous spiritual forces was believed by Dr. Blackwood, drawing on his experience with theological controversies and spiritual deception. That their study of the book and their implementation of its practices had opened them to demonic influence that was now claiming their lives as the price for their spiritual arrogance and departure from orthodox faith was he convinced. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Whitmore Seminary intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the truth about that mysterious book is about to be revealed in ways that will challenge everything you believe about good and evil. On December 22nd reached a breaking point the tension at the seminary when David Crane, unable to bear the weight of his knowledge and guilt any longer, made a desperate decision. The same physical symptoms that had preceded the deaths of his friends had he been experiencing: headaches, insomnia, and a burning sensation in his stomach. That he would be the next victim was convinced he decided to make one final attempt to understand what had happened to them and possibly find a way to break the deadly pattern. To explore parts of the seminary that had been abandoned or forgotten since its construction led David his search for answers. That the book seemed much older than the seminary itself had he remembered Thomas mentioning, which suggested that it might have been hidden in the chapel before the building was even completed. To investigate the history of the land and the circumstances surrounding the seminary's founding led David this possibility. To the basement of the main building took him his search, where old construction materials and abandoned furniture were stored. There, behind a wall that had been bricked up decades earlier, he made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about Whitmore Seminary, and the mysterious book that had cost his friends their lives. Small was the hidden chamber that David uncovered, but filled with items that clearly predated the seminary's construction. There were books, documents, personal effects, and artifacts that suggested someone had deliberately concealed these materials before the building was completed. Most importantly, evidence of the true identity of the man for whom the seminary had been named was contained in the chamber. Completely different from the heroic Revolutionary War minister that the seminary's founders had believed they were honoring was painted a picture of the Reverend Josiah Whitmore by the documents David discovered. Indeed, had the real Josiah Whitmore been a minister, but he had also been involved in occult practices that had scandalized his congregation and ultimately led to his expulsion from the Presbyterian Church. According to the documents, Whitmore had been ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1768 and had served a congregation in eastern Pennsylvania for several years. However, He had gradually become involved with mystical and occult practices that he claimed would enhance his spiritual powers and make him a more effective minister. Elements of folk magic, astrology, and ceremonial magic into his religious practice had he begun to incorporate, justifying these departures from Orthodox Christianity as advanced forms of spiritual knowledge. Initially been impressed by his apparent spiritual gifts and his claims of receiving direct revelations from God had Whitmore's congregation. However, as his practices became more extreme and his teachings more divergent from Presbyterian doctrine, opposition had begun to grow. Of practicing witchcraft and consorting with evil spirits had several church members accused him, charges that Whitmore had vehemently denied while continuing to pursue his occult studies. In 1781 had the situation come to a head when Whitmore had attempted to perform what he described as a great working that would permanently open communication between the physical and spiritual worlds. The participation of 6 volunteers from his congregation, whom he had convinced to serve as vessels for divine manifestation, had required the ritual. In the church during a secret meeting attended only by Whitmore's most devoted followers had the ritual taken place. According to the documents, terribly wrong had gone the ritual. Instead of achieving divine communication, the 6 participants had all died within hours of the ceremony. In the church the next morning, in a state that witnesses described as horrifying, were their bodies found. Not detailed in the documents was the exact nature of their condition, but references to blackened extremities and blasphemous utterances suggested disturbing similarities to what had been happening at the seminary. An immediate scandal that had spread throughout the Pennsylvania Presbyterian community had been caused by the deaths. Arrested and charged with murder had been Whitmore, though he had maintained his innocence and claimed that the deaths were the result of divine judgment on those who had proven unworthy of the spiritual advancement he had offered them. Brief and decisive had been the trial. About Whitmore's occult practices and his departure from Orthodox Christian teaching had testified multiple witnesses. The physical evidence found in the church, including ritual implements, occult books, and geometric patterns carved into the floor, had convinced the jury that Whitmore had indeed been practicing witchcraft, and that his activities had directly caused the deaths of the 6 congregation members. Of witchcraft and murder had Josiah Whitmore been convicted, and had been executed in 1782, not dying heroically in the Revolutionary War, as the seminary's official history claimed. By church authorities who had intended to destroy them had his personal library and ritual implements been confiscated, but had apparently decided instead to hide them away where they could not cause further harm. That the land where Whitmore Seminary had been built was the same property where Josiah Whitmore had conducted his occult practices and where the 6 members of his congregation had died was revealed by the documents. Unaware of this history had been the seminary's founders, having been told that they were honoring a martyred patriot rather than a convicted witch and murderer. That the mysterious book that had been the focus of his study group was Whitmore's personal grimoire was discovered by David, a collection of occult knowledge and ritual instructions that he had compiled over years of study and practice. Not only the spiritual exercises that the group had been performing, but also detailed accounts of Whitmore's experiments in supernatural communication and his theories about opening permanent gateways between the physical and spiritual worlds were contained in the book. Why the book had been hidden in the chapel and why it had such a powerful effect on those who studied it was explained by the grimoire. Deliberately for his occult practices had Whitmore consecrated the land and had designed his rituals to create permanent spiritual openings that would allow supernatural entities to manifest in the physical world. As a trap for anyone who might discover it had the book been placed in the chapel, ensuring that Whitmore's work would continue even after his death. According to the grimoire's instructions, the life force of 6 participants to fuel the opening of gateways between worlds required the ritual that Whitmore had attempted. A failure of the ritual were not the deaths, but rather its intended outcome, providing the spiritual energy necessary for supernatural entities to establish a permanent presence in the physical realm. With growing horror realized David that he and his friends had unknowingly been repeating Whitmore's failed experiment. To serve as the 6 vessels required for the ritual had their study sessions gradually prepared them, and necessary sacrifices for a process that had been set in motion over 40 years earlier were their deaths not random tragedies, but information about how the ritual might be interrupted or prevented had also been contained in the grimoire, though the methods described were as dangerous as the ritual itself. According to Whitmore's notes, destroying the grimoire and performing a counter-ritual that would sever the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds would require breaking the ritual. However, that attempting to break the ritual would result in the immediate death of any remaining vessels was warned by the grimoire, as the supernatural entities would claim their lives to prevent the interruption of the process. Armed with this terrible knowledge, David Crane faced an impossible choice. To break the ritual and save the seminary from further tragedy could he attempt, but doing so would almost certainly cost him his own life. Alternatively, he could allow the process to continue and hope that his death would complete the ritual and end the threat to others, though consequences that extended far beyond the seminary were suggested by the grimoire for the successful completion of Whitmore's work. With this decision spent David the night of December 22 wrestling, reading through Whitmore's notes and trying to understand the full implications of what he and his friends had unleashed. More severely were now affecting him the physical symptoms that had preceded his friends' deaths, and he could feel his time running out. The burning sensation in his stomach had intensified, and the same auditory hallucinations that Thomas had described had he begun to experience. By dawn on December 23, David had made his decision. Dr. Whitley and Dr. Blackwood sought out he and revealed everything he had discovered about the seminary's dark origins and the true nature of the book that had killed his friends. In stunned silence listened the two men as David explained Josiah Whitmore's history and the ritual that had been claiming the lives of the study group members. As a man of science and medicine, Dr. Whitley struggled to accept the supernatural elements of David's account. However, the precision of the deaths, the consistency of the symptoms, and the historical evidence that David had uncovered made it impossible to dismiss his conclusions entirely. With possibilities that lay completely outside his medical training and scientific worldview, found himself forced to consider the doctor. Drawing on his extensive experience with theological controversies and church history, Dr. Blackwood was more prepared to accept the possibility that supernatural forces might be involved. Other cases of occult practices within Christian communities had he encountered, and knew that such activities often led to tragic consequences, though he had never seen anything as systematic and deadly as what was happening at the seminary. In Dr. Blackwood's quarters gathered the three men to examine the evidence that David had uncovered and to decide on a course of action. Clear but terrifying were the grimoire's instructions for breaking the ritual. While performing a counter-ritual that would sever the spiritual connections that Whitmore had established, would they need to destroy the book. For everyone involved would be dangerous the process, but particularly for David as the remaining vessel. On involving Dr. Ashford in their planning insisted Dr. Blackwood, despite the seminary head's continued reluctance to accept supernatural explanations for the deaths. When confronted with the historical evidence and the grimoire itself, Dr. Ashford was forced to acknowledge that something far more complex than a medical epidemic was facing the seminary community. To attempt the counter-ritual on the night of December 23 was made the decision, using the instructions provided in Whitmore's grimoire, but adapting them to reflect Orthodox Christian theology rather than occult practices. The ritual would be led by Dr. Blackwood, drawing on his knowledge of Presbyterian liturgy and his experience with spiritual warfare. Would assist Dr. Whitley and Dr. Ashford, while David would serve as the focal point for breaking the spiritual connections that bound him to the other group members. In the chapel as midnight approached gathered the four men, bringing with them the grimoire and the materials needed for the counter-ritual. Different than it had during regular services felt the chapel, colder, more oppressive, and filled with a sense of spiritual presence that was clearly malevolent. As they prepared for the ritual, the air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe and causing their candles to flicker despite the absence of any breeze. By reading passages from Scripture that specifically addressed spiritual warfare and divine protection, began Dr. Blackwood the counter-ritual. To break the evil influences that had taken hold of the seminary and to protect those who sought to oppose the forces of darkness, called he upon God. Strong and confident was his voice, though the others could see the strain in his face as he confronted spiritual realities that challenged even his experienced faith. As the ritual progressed, the familiar symptoms that had preceded his friends' deaths began to be experienced by David. His hands began to shake and his fingernails started to darken with the same black discoloration that had marked the other victims. However, instead of the violent convulsions that had characterized the previous deaths, he remained conscious and able to participate in the counter-ritual. When they began to burn the grimoire page by page while reciting prayers for divine protection and spiritual cleansing came the climactic moment. As each page was consumed by flames, the spiritual oppression in the chapel seemed to intensify. Dramatically dropped the temperature, across the walls moved shadows despite the steady flame of their candles, and sounds that seemed to come from beneath the floor could they hear, grinding, scraping noises that suggested something trying to break through from below. Words that seemed to come from some source beyond himself spoke David, describing visions of his dead friends who were trapped between worlds and unable to find peace. That he could see the supernatural entities that had been feeding on their life force, said he, beings of darkness and malevolence that had been given access to the physical world through Whitmore's ritual and the study group's unwitting participation. About the attempt to break the ritual were furious the entities and were threatening to claim everyone in the seminary as punishment for the interference. Them trying to take complete control of his body and mind could feel David, using him as a conduit to manifest fully in the physical world. The counter-ritual was preventing them from achieving complete dominance, but both physically and spiritually was tearing him apart. The struggle. As the last page of the grimoire was consumed by flames, a scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel was let out by David. For a moment, the others thought they had lost him to the same fate that had claimed his friends. Up his arms had spread the black discoloration, with violent spasms convulsed his body, and as the entities made their final attempt to claim him, became guttural and inhuman his voice. But then, suddenly, everything changed. Lifted the oppressive atmosphere, returned to normal the temperature, and ceased the supernatural sounds. To the floor, unconscious but breathing, collapsed David, his skin returning to its normal color as the black discoloration faded away. Had worked the counter-ritual, but at a cost that would mark David for the rest of his life. The night was survived by David Crane, but he was forever changed by his experience with forces that lay beyond human understanding. As someone who had looked into the abyss and barely escaped with his soul intact emerged the young man who had entered Whitmore Seminary with dreams of serving God on the frontier from the chapel. As a minister would he spend the rest of his life, but he never spoke publicly about what had happened at the seminary, and he never married or had children, as if he feared passing on some spiritual contamination to future generations. With the destruction of the grimoire and the completion of the counter-ritual ended the deaths at Whitmore Seminary. But from the tragedy that had claimed 15 young lives never recovered the institution. Faced with the historical evidence of Josiah Whitmore's true identity and the occult origins of the seminary's location, the Presbyterian Church authorities decided to close the institution permanently. The need to relocate to a more accessible location was the official reason given, but the real motivation for the closure was understood by those involved in the investigation. His position as head of the seminary was resigned by Dr. Ashford, and he accepted a pastorate in a small Pennsylvania town where he spent the remainder of his career serving a quiet rural congregation. Publicly about the events at Whitmore Seminary spoke he never, though his family noted that he became much more conservative in his theological views and was deeply suspicious of any claims of special revelation or advanced spiritual knowledge. At other Presbyterian institutions found positions both Professor Hartley and Professor Sterling, though their experiences at Whitmore had left them wary of student activities that took place outside the regular curriculum. For stricter oversight of seminary communities and more careful screening of students for signs of spiritual pride or heretical tendencies became they advocates. To other Presbyterian seminaries to complete their education were transferred the surviving students, though many struggled with the trauma of their experiences. The ministry entirely left several, unable to reconcile their faith with the supernatural horrors they had witnessed. Exceptionally orthodox in their theology became others, as if seeking to protect themselves from any hint of the spiritual dangers they had encountered. Never recovered from his experience at the seminary was Dr. Whitley's medical practice. By events that defied medical explanation had been shattered the rational scientific worldview that had guided his career. To a different county shortly after the incident moved he and began drinking heavily, struggling to cope with memories that challenged everything he had believed about the nature of reality. Of liver disease in 1835 died he eventually, his family reporting that he suffered from terrible nightmares for the rest of his life and would often wake up screaming about blackened fingernails and blasphemous Latin phrases. To his administrative duties in Philadelphia returned Dr. Blackwood, But the experience at Whitmore Seminary had profoundly affected his understanding of spiritual warfare and the reality of supernatural evil. On identifying and combating occult influences within Christian communities became one of the Presbyterian Church's leading experts. Though he was careful never to discuss the specific details of what had happened at the seminary, and eventually sold to a private buyer who was unaware of their dark history, abandoned the buildings at Whitmore Seminary. Into a private residence was converted the main building, while the other structures were either demolished or repurposed for agricultural use. Into a living room was converted the chapel where the grimoire had been discovered and destroyed, though visitors often commented on the room's unusual atmosphere, describing it as cold and oppressive even on warm days. By 2 centuries of agricultural activity has been completely obliterated the cemetery where the 15 victims were originally buried. In the 1840s, when the land was converted to farming, were moved the bodies, but even the public cemetery where they were reinterred has undergone changes that have obscured their final resting places. The simple stones that once marked their graves have been replaced or removed, and their names are no longer associated with any particular location. Perhaps most significantly, the spiritual contamination that Josiah Whitmore sought to create on the property appears to have been successfully cleansed by the counter-ritual performed by Dr. Blackwood and his companions. Unlike other locations associated with occult practices, the former seminary grounds show no signs of ongoing supernatural activity. For nearly 2 centuries has the land been productive and peaceful, suggesting that David Crane's sacrifice and the destruction of the grimoire effectively severed the spiritual connections that had made the tragedy possible. Ultimately serves as both a historical mystery and a spiritual cautionary tale, the story of Whitmore Seminary. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, even knowledge presented in religious terms, can become dangerous when it leads away from humility, community accountability, and orthodox faith. Evil people were not the 15 young men who died, but they were proud people who believed they could handle spiritual forces that were beyond their understanding and control. The way that past sins can continue to affect future generations is also demonstrated by their deaths. As Josiah Whitmore's occult practices created conditions that would claim innocent lives decades after his own execution, the seminary's founders had no way of knowing that they were building on cursed ground. But from the consequences of its dark heritage did not protect the institution their ignorance. Both the strengths and limitations of institutional religion when confronted with supernatural evil shows the response of the church authorities to the crisis. Probably saved the seminary community from even greater tragedy. Dr. Blackwood's willingness to take spiritual warfare seriously and to act decisively in the face of unexplained deaths, however, has prevented future generations from learning important lessons about spiritual discernment and the reality of supernatural evil. The Church's subsequent decision to suppress information about the incident, while understandable from a pastoral perspective, the limitations of purely naturalistic approaches to understanding human experience illustrates the medical profession's response to the incident, as represented by Dr. Whitley's experience. To diagnose and treat physical ailments prepared Dr. Whitley's scientific training him, but it left him completely unprepared to deal with phenomena that appeared to have spiritual rather than material causes. That some experiences are too traumatic to be processed within a purely secular worldview suggest his subsequent alcoholism and early death. That it is possible to encounter supernatural evil and emerge spiritually intact is demonstrated by David Crane's survival and his subsequent ministry career, but only through reliance on divine protection and orthodox Christian faith. The highest ideals of Christian service is reflected by his willingness to sacrifice his own life to save others, while the lasting effects that such experiences can have on those who survive them shows his lifelong struggle with trauma. Broader cultural changes in American society's understanding of spiritual reality reflects the gradual fading of memory about the Whitmore Seminary incident. In 1823, still believed in the reality of supernatural forces and the possibility of spiritual warfare did most Americans. By the late 19th century, scientific materialism had begun to replace religious explanations for unusual phenomena, making it easier for incidents like the Whitmore tragedy to be forgotten or reinterpreted in naturalistic terms. Today, both religious and secular worldviews is challenged by the story of Whitmore Seminary. For believers, it serves as a reminder that spiritual warfare is real and that the pursuit of religious knowledge must be balanced by humility and submission to orthodox teaching. For skeptics, it presents a historical puzzle that resists easy explanation and forces consideration of possibilities that lie outside the bounds of materialistic thinking. About what other secrets might be hidden in family attics and church archives across America also raise questions the recently discovered letters and documents that have brought the Whitmore Seminary story to light. How many other incidents of supernatural activity have been forgotten or suppressed over the centuries? From tragedies that were deliberately erased from historical memory, might what lessons be learned? To contemporary concerns about the dangers of spiritual pride and the pursuit of esoteric knowledge outside the bounds of established religious authority also speaks the story. In an age when alternative spiritualities and claims of special revelation are increasingly common, the fate of the Whitmore Seminary Study Group serves as a warning about the potential consequences of abandoning traditional safeguards and community accountability. Of nothing more than ambition and curiosity were guilty the 15 young men who died at Whitmore Seminary, qualities that are generally considered virtues in American culture. That even positive character traits can become dangerous when they lead away from humility and wisdom reminds us their tragedy. To seek shortcuts to spiritual power that ultimately destroyed them and left lasting scars on all who knew them led their desire to become extraordinary ministers them. While successful in preventing immediate panic and scandal, the Presbyterian Church's handling of the incident also demonstrates the costs of institutional secrecy. Their organization's reputation was protected by church authorities by suppressing information about what had happened, but also ensured that future generations would be unable to learn from the tragedy. That other important historical events may have been similarly concealed is suggested by the recent discovery of hidden documents, waiting for accident or providence to bring them to light. Perhaps most importantly, that human beings are spiritual as well as physical creatures is served as a reminder by the story of Whitmore Seminary, and that our spiritual choices have real consequences that extend beyond our individual lives. Spiritual conditions that affected innocent people decades after his death were created by the occult practices of Josiah Whitmore, while spiritual health to a contaminated location was restored by the faithful response of David Crane and his companions. In our increasingly secular age, stories like that of Whitmore Seminary challenge us to consider the possibility that spiritual realities are as important as physical ones, and that our choices about faith, morality, and religious practice have consequences that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Whether we interpret the events in supernatural or psychological terms, the tragedy serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility, community accountability, and careful discernment in all matters of faith and spirituality. That the most terrifying evils often grow from the purest intentions is shown by this mystery, and that the road to damnation can be paved with sincere desires to serve God. Not just a tale of supernatural horror is the story of Whitmore Seminary, but a meditation on the dangers of spiritual pride and the importance of maintaining humility in our relationship with the divine. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the ruins of that Pennsylvania seminary? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think really happened during that terrible winter of 1823. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. Until next time, remember that some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some knowledge is too dangerous to seek. See you in the next video.